Yo, what's going on? We're back at it. Yeah, man. Preaching Labs 2019/2020. We talked about, and I'm just giving you right now a little bit of bone structure, is what it's called theologically. So when we talk about bone structure, I'm talking about giving you the nuts and the bolts as it relates to building your message. It's easy. Watch this. Listen to me. It's easy to preach a piece of text and just grab it and run with it. It's the work is research. The work is understanding the totality of the text. You're going to hear me say that, and I'm going to press that upon you. If you're going to be a minister here at Church Without Walls, you're going to always hear me talk about the totality of the text, because I think that's one of the things that's missing, especially in our culture. We're very celebratory in our culture, so it's easy to grab a piece of text and begin to run with it and just get people excited about it and not give them the actual bones, the nuts and the bolts of the text. So I want to talk, we talked about exegeting and eisegeting for just a few moments. I want to talk about hermeneutics and homiletics. Hermeneutics is the science of interpreting scripture. That's what that means. It is the science of interpreting scripture. So there's a few things that hermeneutics includes. It includes the intent of the text. It includes content, and it includes context. Well, the most important thing for me within there, we already talked about content and context. What the most important thing for me in there is the intention of the text. Well, to know the intention of the text, there's a few things I need to know. I need to know, first of all, the heart of God. If you're taking notes, make sure you put this down. The scripture will never, ever contradict the heart of God. Say that with me. The scripture will never, ever contradict the heart of God. Well, I need to know the heart of God. What are the attributes of God? Who is God, right? So I know God to be, God is love. What does that mean, though? He is a God that has agape love. That is unconditional love. It's not his will that any man should perish. So here I begin to decipher the difference between God and us. Because if I'm not careful, I'm going to convey to my people who are listening that God has human emotions like me. So a few things to avoid. Always try your best to avoid saying God is getting sick and tired, because that is not God. That is all you. You would come out better just being honest and saying, I'm getting tired and I'm getting sick of people doing A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Even when the wrath of God is introduced, it's not because God is sick and tired. It's because man has triggered that wrath. God literally has enough grace and enough patience for eternity. It's not his will that any man should perish. So even though it's not his will, we still have our own free will. So things have been set in place that we trigger on ourselves. It's not God doing it. We literally trigger it on ourselves because it's already been set in place. So when we deal with hermeneutics, right, we want to make sure that we do not give God our feelings and our emotions. So even when the scripture talks about he is a jealous God, well, that's not jealousy the way that we're jealous. So we got to be careful with putting our emotions on God. So from a hermeneutical standpoint, or hermeneutical, whichever way you want to say it, let's draw some things. So one piece of text I want to talk about, the intent. The intention of God, knowing the heart of God, helps me when I begin to interpret the scripture. 1 Corinthians 14:34. You've heard this, or you probably heard this a million times. Women should be silent in the church or during church meetings. It is not proper for them to speak. They should be submissive, just as the law says. So if I grab that piece of text, I'm easily making a doctrine that says women can't preach, women can't teach, women basically can't do anything inside the church. Well, what is the intent? So I got to be able to deal with the intent. I got to deal with the context first. The context of 1 Corinthians 14, I've got to go back to 1 Corinthians 12 to begin to understand. Paul is talking about spiritual giftings. So let's matriculate. He goes from spiritual gifts, how to operate in spiritual gifts. Then he goes over to love, how you're supposed to deal with love, what love is. Love is not boastful. Love is not proud. Love is not this. Love is not that. Then he jumps over into 1 Corinthians 14, and he is setting order, listen, for the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians 14, the intent of that book is to set order for the church at Corinth. And we know that to be the case because when you drop down a few other verses, he says, let all prophesy. Well, all would be women. But how can women prophesy? They've got to be silent, right? Well, that's not a contradiction. That's poor understanding on the preacher's part. So I've got to make sure that I've done my hermeneutical homework, research to make sure I understand the intent. I know the intent cannot be for women not to say anything in church. Why? Because Paul has women apostles that flow with him. Paul talks about take care of those women who labor with me in the gospel. He has women out here risking their lives with him to spread the gospel of Christ. So that cannot be in the intent. So from a hermeneutic standpoint, a hermeneutical standpoint, I've got to make sure I preach the intention of the text and not the opinion of the text. The opinion is mine. The intention is God's. The writer always has the intention. It's my job to study to find out what the intentions are. So when you deal with hermeneutics, we're talking about intent. We're talking about context, and we're talking about content. So you want to make sure that you stay exactly where you need to be. You want to make sure that you have a good grasp and a good understanding of those principles. So as we move forward, the next thing we're going to talk about is homiletics. But we've got to make sure that we have our hermeneutics complete, because homiletics is grabbing what we just researched from a hermeneutical standpoint and pulling that across a bridge so it can be communicated to those who are hearing. So if my hermeneutics is off, guess what? My homiletics is going to be off. I cannot be right in one sense and wrong in the other sense. With these things, I'm either right or I'm wrong. And if my hermeneutics is wrong, then I'm wrong in my homiletics, regardless of how wonderful it sounds. So we'll jump on that next. So we've talked about exegeting, eisegeting. We've talked about hermeneutics. We'll talk about homiletics, and then we'll finish building our skeleton of a outline. God bless. Peace.